There's a grammar trend right now to make verbs out of nouns. Think text. Literally it means printed word, but if I say, hey, text me, using it as a verb, you know what I mean. It's not a new trend, but part of the dynamic nature of language. For example, Olympians have medaled, turning the thing, a medal, into the verb to receive a medal for longer than I've been alive. I found out this week that the word parable is part of this trend in reverse. The literal definition of the Greek word parable means to cast alongside. The word combines the verb to cast with the adverb close by or alongside, creating the noun parable. A parable is a teaching that is cast alongside an invitation to wonder. Wonder about these little nuggets of wisdom that Jesus cast alongside us. He put them near us, not in us. It's an invitation to bring curiosity and our willingness to be changed by them into our hearts. In Godly Play, the storytelling method we use in our family feasts, we hear parables are very old. Parables were given to you before you were born. Parables are very valuable, maybe even more valuable than gold. Parables are like presents. Parables can be hard to get into. You have to be ready to go inside a parable. Sometimes it opens for you right away, but don't be discouraged if it doesn't. Always come back, because someday the parable will let you in. Parables are funny little things gifted to us by Jesus, cast alongside us as an invitation to wonder. Today's parable, which we heard twice, once from Jesus and once from the author of the Gospel of Matthew, has been cast alongside us, sown in the soil of our imaginations. Let's see if it will open for us this morning. The first telling we heard was by Jesus to a large crowd that gathered around him as he sat by the water. He commands them, listen. And then he talks about the sower. The sower throws seed in every place imaginable, places where a farmer would not typically sow seeds. If the sower were a human farmer, they would be much more discerning, checking on the quality of the soil before sowing the seed. But this sower throws seed wherever they go. I wonder why the sower wasn't more careful about where the seeds landed. Like the word parable, the sower casts seed alongside wherever they happen to be, without regard for what will become of the seed. The sower's job, apparently, is just to sow. The seeds fall in different conditions, and the conditions dictate what happens to the seed. When we read this in our study group on Monday, we realized that there were many more possibilities for what could happen to the seed than was explicitly stated. We wondered what happened to the seeds eaten by the birds. Were they carried and deposited elsewhere with a little bundle of fertilizer? Were they able to grow into happy plants? The seeds scorched by the sun, did they decompose into nutrients for the soil? The action in Jesus' telling of the parable, our first hearing of it, follows the sower, who is the protagonist of that story. I wonder why the parable follows the action of the sower. I wonder how those on the shore, listening to Jesus speak from the boat, felt about the sower. Jesus' original hearers might have been a little upset, I think, with the sower, who was wasting seed by sowing it where it had no chance of taking root. Why waste so much seed? The kicker, the answer, is that when the seed does take root, it produces 30, 60, 100. One author I read suggested that a yield of 4 or 5 would be considered good, so 30, 60, 100 would be amazing. Perhaps one can afford to be a little extravagant in their sowing if the yields are so high. Now, you might have noticed when we heard the story that we skipped a few verses in between. And if you're wondering what they said, those verses are Jesus' answer to the disciples asking why he is speaking in parables. He says, "In order that those whose eyes and ears are ready to receive my message, they can receive it. But those who are not ready will never perceive it." Those of us open to using our curiosity and our creativity, open to coming to the story with wonder, can find meaning in this story beyond the obvious. While those whose worldview is entrenched, those for whom even new factual evidence can't change their mind, will only see the surface. And then Matthew's Jesus tells the disciples what he meant by the parable of the sower. Today we're approaching this parable with wonder to find the little nugget that Jesus cast alongside us. What happens to our wonder when we turn the question of the parable into Matthew's answer? My reading of this second telling has been colored by Joachim Jeremias, a German theologian whose specialty was form criticism, the study of the form of the story. Form critics can tell you exactly what a parable is, what a folk tale is, what a psalm is, what the difference is between all of those. They study the form of storytelling. Jeremias is a leading expert on parables, and he thinks that the first and second telling of the parable of the sower are in fact 2 different parables. He credits Jesus with the first telling, the parable of the sower, and the author of the Gospel of Matthew with the second, the parable of the 4 soils. The reasoning has to do with the protagonist of the story. In the first telling, the protagonist is the sower. The thing that would catch the audience's attention was the weird actions of the sower. The sower is suspiciously absent from Matthew's explanation. His retelling of the parable instead follows the actions of the soil, the path, the rocky ground, the soil with the thorns. The protagonist is the soil's interaction with the seed. In writing down this parable and explaining why Jesus used parables, the author of the Gospel of Matthew has explained the parable in a way that doesn't necessarily contain Jesus' original intent. The gift of the parable opened to Matthew's community in the way explained in this second telling, and the gift was meaningful to them. They were in the business of sharing the good news of the way of Jesus. They were banking on the 30, 60, 100 yield that the seed could have when sown in good soil. The parable becomes an example of how to prepare ourselves to receive seed, how to tend our personal soil, and how to sow seeds that will be fruitful, to seek the good soil, the people ready to hear the good news. In this retelling, we are the hearers, and the way we hear the good news of Jesus is our soil. We are tasked with being good soil. The interpretation can have meaning for us. Where should we sow the good news of the ministry of this congregation? How should we each receive the teachings of Jesus? There's good stuff here. But rarely in the Gospels is there such an easy explanation. Jesus tells us that he preaches in parables in order to make the teaching a gift to those whose hearts are truly open in wonder. And Matthew's explanation is rather straightforward, kind of obvious, particularly because generations of biblical scholars have taken it at face value. if we approach the study with open curiosity, with questions instead of answers, might we receive a different gift, one meant just for us? For me, when I read Matthew's interpretation, my wonder is answered. It's neatly tied up. But maybe that's not why Jesus spoke in parables, for neatly tied endings. He spoke in parables to engage our curiosity, to open our minds to possibilities, a necessary step for engaging in God's kingdom, which is full of wonderful possibilities. Let's open our hearts, let's open our curiosity and see what we find in this parable. Here is the parable from Eugene Peterson's paraphrase called The Message. What do you make of this? Peterson begins. Let us wonder with that question as you hear his telling. What do you make of this? A sower sowed seed. As they scattered, some of it fell on the road, and birds ate it. Some fell in the gravel. It sprouted quickly, but didn't put down roots. So when the sun came up, it withered just as quickly. Some fell in the weeds as it came up. It was strangled by the weeds. Some fell on good earth and produced a harvest beyond our wildest dreams. Are you listening to this? Really listening? What do you make of this? That is not a rhetorical question. What do you make of this? A sower sowed seed. As they scattered the seed, some of it fell on the road and birds ate it. Some fell in the gravel. It sprouted quickly but didn't put down roots. So when the sun came up, it withered just as quickly. Some fell in the weeds as it came up. It was strangled by the weeds. Some fell on good earth and produced a harvest beyond our wildest dreams. When you hear this, what do you hear?
I think about the outreach that our church does, and, just sowing seeds out in our community. And, some of those seeds, sprout within people, and they come and join our church.
You think of sowing seeds in the community, planting seeds through our outreach.
I got a different take on it. To me, it talks about what kind of person you are and the state of your soul. And I don't want to say like good person, bad person, but there are those that, we all know that there are those that come to church and they make their appearance and they listen and then they leave and they don't go out and do God's work and they don't, fertilize that seed. They don't take it to heart. They don't accept it fully into their soul and understand it. And so those are the people that maybe are the outliers or, they're trying to do the right thing or they have good intentions, but maybe don't fully accept the Lord.
So you hear we are the soil, and how we receive the good news here on a Sunday is what our soil is.
Something that I find troubling is there's a little bit of a judgment type thing in here, and it's like if you're the sower, do you just go ahead and sow, or do you say, oh, this is rocky, or this is, and how do you know? How can you, in the story, it sounds like, well, you can see that it's rocky, you can see that there's weeds there, but in real life, do you make a judgment and say, well, I'm not going to share with this person because it'll never go anywhere?
So that your curiosity takes you to you are the sower, and what is your job as a sower? Is it, as in the first telling, you just sow because that's what you do. Wherever you go, you sow the seed, right? Regardless of what the soil is. Or do you have a responsibility to be more discerning in where you throw your seed? Good question.
I kind of think of it in terms of my life and how Christ is always offering me this seed. Sometimes it just is ignored and goes away, and flies away. Sometimes I might dabble a little bit and then just, that's not for me. And then I move on and start to maybe start to grow, and then all kinds of other things are happening in my life to strangle me. And then sometimes, and hopefully, I'm on that path now in the soil, the good soil.
So the sower to you is Christ constantly reaching out to you. And you can be simultaneously or at different times all of the kinds of soil. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I see that the sower is like spread love everywhere. Spread God's love everywhere. It's open for everyone.
So Susan hears the sower. You just spread love. You just sow it. It's everywhere. Isn't it fascinating that we can see this from so many different angles when we're open to it? Godly Play begins their section about parables with a story they call the parable of the parables. And it goes something like this. Parables are gifts that were given to you before you were born. They can be hard to open, but don't worry if they don't open for you this time. Come back. They will eventually open for you. In this gift, in this box, we find the gift of the parable we heard today. Let's open it and see what's inside. It's a box. There's a box in the box. That's a little weird. Maybe it's so precious we had to put it in 2 boxes. Let's try again. It's a box. Let's see. What might be in this parable for us to learn? It's another box. It's like a parable within a parable, just like our reading today. 2 parables within the first one that Jesus told. This one has a 3rd and a 4th. It's getting pretty small though. The meaning must be in this one, right? It's a box. This can't go on much longer. We must be able to find the actual Jesus meaning in this one, right? What do you think? Somewhere in here is the actual Jesus meaning to this parable. This is gonna be it. You're not gonna stack much higher, so.
We had a question.
The little Russian dolls.
Yeah.
When it's having
This meaning is getting pretty small now, isn't it? How small and precious must the actual original Jesus meaning be for this parable? Let's see. What's the likelihood? Well, we're not going to be able to get much smaller than that. Let's see. How many meanings can one parable have? Actual Jesus meaning to the parable. Can you see it? It's very small, very precious. Maybe that's why it's in so many boxes. People who heard it put it in the gold top box to keep it safe. And then Matthew and his community said, oh, it also belongs in this box. And on it went. Each hearer finding the precious, precious meaning that worked in that community. For 1,000 years, the gift was wrapped and handed to the next generation. And on past that, all the way to, 1894, when this congregation was established, wrapped, precious in the gold box, and handed on maybe to your grandparents who loved the parable and learned it and taught it to your parents. Here's when we learn that sometimes the teaching goes a little askew. You gotta go back and really bring your curiosity to it. And then you can wrap it precious from your grandparents to your parents.
God's testing.
Right on to us, to the meaning we come up with today, the meaning that the parable is talking about our life, and the times when we're rocky soil and the times when we're good soil. We find out that the parable is talking about the outreach that our church does as we go out there and sow seeds, or that the parable is talking about God's extravagant love that's always being sown to us. All of these meanings we came to today, wrapped in the precious gold box. I wonder who will open the box next? Who do we gift this to because the parables are precious to us? And what meaning will they wrap around it? The parable of the parables. Parables are gifts, precisely because a part of it is unseen until it reveals itself to us. Matthew and Matthew's community tell us what revealed itself to them from this parable, and it was a good and fruitful teaching. We today have found gifts from this parable. May it, like these never-ending boxes, continue to open itself to us and to our descendants as we seek to be sowers and seeds and soil in the way of Jesus. Amen.